Cloud. Welcome to another in a series of monthly program meetings sponsored by the Woods and Wetlands Group of the Illinois Sierra Club. My name is Rosemary Heileman, and I will be your host this evening. Our monthly program meetings feature speakers on topics relating to our environment, stewardship, wildlife and nature, public policy, and anything about outdoor activities like hiking and canoeing, bird watching. Tonight is our first fall program. In a minute, we will hear from our featured speaker for September, Rebekah Snyder of the Lake County Forest Preserve District, who will share some information about old growth forests. But first, we have a couple of announcements. We are recording this so you can watch it in the future. Turn off your camera if you don't wish to appear on the video. We will send out the YouTube address for the program later this week so you can watch it again or share the link with your friends. Before we begin, please make sure you are muted, especially if you have a barking dog, a television, or other commotion in the background. Please feel free to ask any questions of our speaker this evening by using the chat room at the bottom of your screen. We will select questions afterward, and they will be directed to the speaker. So let's move on to our featured speaker this evening. I'm going to spotlight Rebekah. Rebekah Snyder comes to us this evening with not only a profound love of nature and the environment, but also a rich history of conservation and preservation experiences. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Environmental Science at Northwestern University and a Master of Environmental Management at Yale University. Rebekah has worked in many environmental organizations, such as the Chicago Botanic Gardens and the Nature Conservancy. She was the Chief Development Officer and Executive Director of the Preservation Foundation, where she designed, implemented, and managed programs, as well as produced significant financial contributions. Currently, Rebekah is the Director of Community Engagement and Partnerships for the Lake County Forest Preserve District. Her love of nature and our native environment is reflected in her work. Even though she is not a scientist, but this has been her whole career. Tonight, we welcome Rebekah Snyder to celebrate Lake County's old growth forests. Welcome, Rebekah.
Thank you very much. That was a really kind introduction. I appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about the Lake County Forest Preserve. Actually, some of you probably know it better than I do, but I'll do my best. I've been with the Lake County Forest Preserves just over almost 11 and a half years. So I know a little bit. I think I've scratched the surface. As Rosemary said, I am not a scientist. So I will start off with an apology about the fact that this talk isn't exactly about the unique natural environment of our dedicated old growth forest at St. Francis Woods. It's not really about the plants and animals or the deep ecology of an old growth forest. I'm coming at it from the leadership of the Lake County Forest Preserve District and why we wanted to get involved in this partnership with the Old Growth Forest Network. And I reflected back on your group, what I know about it. And I know that you're not just interested in plants and animals and beautiful landscapes, but you're interested in big vision around environmental issues. You're interested in policy and funding. So I hope I'm hitting the right point. We could always have Dr. Patty Vick come back, our Natural Resources Director, or Ken Click, some of you know, one of our plant specialists, to talk details about the site itself. I always have to start a presentation about the Lake County Forest Preserves with the big picture, because so many times, maybe not with this group, but so many times people just don't understand the scope and scale of what we do. So just a couple of slides about the Lake County Forest Preserves. Here's our mission: to preserve a dynamic and unique system of diverse natural and cultural resources. So we really talk a lot about Lake County's natural environment as well as its cultural history. And the lands that we protect are the foundation on which we build education programs and recreational programs. But really, we talk about these 4 pillars. You'll see these all over our general offices if you've ever been to one of our public meetings. We talk about preserving the land, and we are the largest landowner in Lake County. We talk about restoring the land, and we have an extremely active program of doing that. In fact, about 2/3 of our 31,000 acres have been restored to some level to date, which is really just because of decades and decades of support and kind of a conservation focus or bias in our organization. And of course, we have award-winning education programs, primarily for students under, say, 8th grade, but we do increasingly offer programs around state learning standards for high school students as well. And then, of course, recreation, passive recreation primarily. So you may not see us put a pickleball court in, but lots of trails and beautiful vistas. I have to take a moment to talk about our 100-year vision for Lake County. It was only about 8 years ago that we decided to create this vision that said, okay, the past 60 years, by the way, this is our 65th anniversary. Up until that point, I think we'd been building a system and, acquiring the land and restoring the land and building a professional staff. Around 2014, we decided to say, what is the next 100 years like? And I'm not going to go into it in great detail because it is a very dense 6-page document that we all have on our desks. And we do live and breathe it. But the thing I want to point out is that our 100-year vision is really for all of Lake County and not just the Lake County Forest Preserves. And when I say that we live and breathe this plan, that's what I mean. Today's conversation about the Old Growth Forest Network is about how the Forest Preserves goes beyond its own boundaries, because we know that we cannot do this alone. We cannot protect Lake County's natural areas and make our lands more resilient if we don't motivate and inspire others to do the same. So just a quick snapshot of the dimensions. You've probably seen this map. This is our almost current map of the Lake County Forest Preserves in the light green, the dark kind of brownish grayish. You're probably familiar with those state lands. Those are state lands. But the light green are the 64 different Lake County Forest Preserves. Astute observers will know that it's not been updated since we acquired recently a 77-acre parcel as an addition to Fort Sheridan Forest Preserves. Many of you may know the Open Lands Lakeshore Preserve, which was protected by Open Lands Chicago for 15 years, recently became a part of Fort Sheridan Forest Preserve. So it's not quite up to date. But this is our holdings, which are with that Open Lands Lakeshore acquisition about 2 weeks ago. We're at 31,150 acres across 64 different sites, believe it or not. And that's what always gets people. Most people know Middle Fork Savannah or Independence Grove or Fort Sheridan, of course, but we do have 64 different sites spread around the county. You're never more than a 10-minute drive. With that, we have about 200 miles of trail. So those are inside those 64 sites, as well as those regional trails, which you see on the map there. That's what those colored trails are. Obviously, there are other trails managed by other agencies to put together, a mosaic of trails in Lake County. I think we're past 550 miles of multi-use trail. With all of those holdings, about 86% of the holdings are completely undeveloped. So I always say to people, when you're walking along your favorite stretch of trail, you're scratching the surface of the forest preserves. Most of what goes on is well beyond the visitor experience or the user experience. And we do have at least 4 million annual visitors. It's probably a lot more than that, but to be honest with you, we're a little behind on data collection. One of the things we'll be focusing on as we continue to implement that 100-year vision is how do we really understand our users, investing in understanding how and when and where people are connecting with us. But a rough number is about 4 million. We've also had more than 7,000 donors through our Preservation Foundation. I won't say much about that group, but many of you know it. Some of you are supporters of it. And that's the charitable foundation that supports the forest preserves. My past job, I was executive director of that group. I've since hired my replacement, so I still get to oversee fundraising and grants for the forest preserves through the foundation. And then the last thing I'll say is kind of the dimensions of the district is that we always keep track of public opinion about, now this is resident surveys. This is not voter surveys. So last time we did this was last summer, of course, on the heels of COVID-19. It's not surprising, but these high ratings numbers have been consistent for decades. 85% of residents rated us favorably, and we were the highest among any unit of local government. We don't take that for granted. 78% of residents have visited in the past year, which is kind of remarkable because a lot of times they don't know they're in a forest preserve. They think it's a park district site. And finally, 89% of those who do visit expressed satisfaction or high satisfaction with their experience. Now I'm veering a little bit because I think this is relevant to the conversation about old growth forests. So you're familiar with the last map, but what you may not have seen is this really colorful, beautiful map of Lake County spilling over into the boundaries in Wisconsin and McHenry and Cook County. But this is actually the restoration potential of our county. It's kind of astonishing if you ask me. That purple is prairies, grasslands, and savannas that are in open space right now and either already restored or have the potential for restoration. A lot of those are our holdings. Some of those are private lands. Some of those are in farming. The light blue is wetland restoration, either already restored or high potential for restoration. The greenish, the ugly brown is aquatic restoration, and then woodlands and forest restoration are in that orange color. So we have a lot of nature in Lake County, and there's also a lot of restoration potential in Lake County as well. This comes from a document we created about 5 or 6 years ago called our Green Infrastructure Model and Strategy. And it really tells us where to focus our resources. This is part of a 200-page document with all kinds of data sets. But I picked this one out because I really think it speaks to not just the work we have to do on our lands, but getting back to that, our vision is for all Lake County. We need to get all Lake County residents doing what they can on their own properties, whether in private lands or public lands. So that brings me to just a couple of things about how we think about working across boundaries. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. Of course, we have conservation partnerships. You all know that nature doesn't respect political boundaries. It doesn't respect property lines. So we have many, many conservation partnerships. A couple I'll mention are, for example, along Lake Michigan, about 4,000 acres crossing the state boundary. We have 16 agencies working together to restore that globally important landscape along Lake Michigan. We call that the Lake Plain Partnership. And then down at the other corner of the county near the Barrington area, we're a part of a Barrington Greenway initiative, which is actually led by a different organization, Citizens for Conservation. But again, an example of where we're always working across boundaries to restore land more efficiency, to find funding more efficiently, and really working with partners to make sure we're all headed in the same direction. We also do planning partnerships with the forest preserves. This is going to make a lot of sense, but those regional trails, they don't come together because just with one agency taking lead. It always takes multiple agencies working on regional trail connections or even other preserve access improvement projects. We have public safety partnerships, believe it or not. Our Ranger Forest Preserve Police have more land to patrol than any other jurisdiction in Lake County. That makes sense as the largest landowner. So they're constantly working with the Sheriff's Department and all the municipal agencies, just to give you an example. And of course, education partnerships. We touch every school in Lake County, and to different degrees have relationships with educators and school administrators. Again, putting those programs into the schools because it's a core part of our mission. And then the last thing is what I do, community engagement and partnerships. And this rolls into this old growth forest network. And I hope I'm building the story of why we would go toward this partnership with a national organization like Old Growth Forest Network. Under community engagement and partnerships, I'll admit, I don't actually know what it means yet because I and my team and my boss, Ty Kovac, we're all still building that right now. But generally what community engagement means is we can't take that all those good numbers for granted. We can't take the next referendum for granted. We have to be constantly building relationships with individuals, with groups like yourselves, having a two-way dialogue with users. That's what community engagement means. Sometimes it means those people are going to become users. Sometimes they're going to become donors. Sometimes they're going to become volunteers. Sometimes they're going to become voters. Sometimes they're going to push back on us on things. So we mean for this community engagements, which is kind of a new area for us and for me to work on, to really just build, like I said, that two-way relationship with the residents that we serve. So now to I think I'm on time. Yeah, I'm doing good. This next section is really about old growth forests. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know why they were important. It just sounded like a buzzword to me. So let's start with what are old growth forests. And I've done a lot of research on this, both since we had the dedication of St. Francis Woods And there really is not one definition. It's a little frustrating. I wanted to be able to tell you that an old growth forest has trees that are at least 150 years old. There's a little bit written about that from the federal government, and this is a fairly recent executive order. Some of you may have heard of it, but the Biden administration in 2022 issued an executive order, and this is the name of it: strengthen the nation's forests, communities, and local economies. And by my understanding, this is a new effort and an ongoing effort to actually define what that means, and also where are they and how can we protect them and what policies must we have. This came out in April this year. It's just a 2-page document about defining mature and old growth forests. And I just put this up here because it's only 2 pages. The US government and local governments like ours, we're all kind of working on what this definition is. And the main reason it's so squishy, I'll say, is that old growth forests look very different all across the United States. That makes a lot of sense. In Northern California, an old growth forest is 1,000-acre redwoods community. But here in Lake County, St. Francis Woods is probably 150 to 200-year-old trees. And yet for here, that old growth forest of Lake County is just as rich and important as the redwoods of Northern California. So I think you can kind of understand the picture of why there is no satisfying, clear definition of what an old growth forest is. And I'll just say that the literature I've been reading uses the words mature and old growth pretty interchangeably. It's just a spectrum. I mean, when do any of us get old? When are we go from mature to old? I don't know. It probably varies by person, doesn't it? So continuing, I have found a couple of kind of specific definitions. Actually, this one comes from the Forest Service from 1989. So it's something that the federal government has been thinking about for a couple of decades. But mostly these definitions talk about the dynamic systems that are present in old growth forests, whether they're 1,000-year-old old or 150-year-old old. It speaks to the age of their trees, but the related structures between old and new growth. Always it references that for that region, an old growth forest has relatively later stages of stand development, stand being, of course, tree development, that differ from earlier stages. So it makes a lot of sense. When you think about old growth forests, you're going to think about areas that have been allowed relative to everywhere else around them to grow and mature and kind of deepen their connections between the species in an old growth forest. The simpler definition I found, and I'll stop at the definitions, is that an old growth forest is one that has attained great age without significant disturbance, and thereby exhibits unique ecological features and might be classified as a climax community. And that part's important, I think, because for Lake County, St. Francis Woods is one of those climax communities, meaning relative to everything else around it, it's the oldest thing we've got. So a little bit more I just learned about old growth forests in the US. I've been saying that the federal government, which of course has the vast majority of our lands in the United States, has some interesting numbers on old growth forests in the US. So primarily those federal lands are held by the Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management. The former has 32 million acres of old growth forest. I'm sorry, together they both hold about 32 million acres of old growth and 80 million acres of mature forest. And this is coming back from those federal government reports I was referencing earlier. So of all forested land, and just forested land that the US government owns, about 18% of it is old growth and about 45% of it is mature. So that sounds like pretty good numbers. And it is. Keep going. Well, I'll get to the threat in a minute. So why is this so important? Again, why do we care about this definition of what old growth means? It kind of makes sense, right? This group knows what nature does for us, all of those services that nature provides. It's actually interesting to me that scientists aren't sure. Even like I went to Yale, to Yale University, which has the oldest the oldest forestry program in the country. And even coming out of Yale, the research is not clear that old growth forests actually say sequester more carbon, which I thought was kind of interesting. You might think that they must, because they're so old, they must do it the best. Not necessarily, but old growth forests do absolutely sequester carbon. Like all forests, they contribute to air quality. They absorb stormwater. the same. So they infiltrate stormwater into the aquifer. They clean the stormwater before it can go into surface water. They protect us against flooding. They reduce surface temperatures. And of course, they host huge amounts of biodiversity. But what I think is really neat about this growing field of what old growth forests are and why they're important is the social and the economic and the cultural values of these forests. Again, in Illinois and in Northern California. It's a really cool concept, recognizing that they're special not just because of what they give us in terms of ecosystem services, but what they mean to Indigenous peoples, what they mean to non-Indigenous peoples, to people who, to the social experiences, obviously economic contributions, because some of these are timbered and harvested forests, and of course their cultural values. I don't need to explain to this group how important, forests can speak to individuals. And so I love that in this definition, there's a recognition that old growth forests are important because they're old intrinsically. And then finally, why are old growth forests important? Despite those really good seeming numbers of the federal government, only a few old growth remnant forests exist in the United States. So across the entire United States, less than 5% of old growth forests exist in the Western US and less than 1% exists in the Eastern United States. And of course, the Midwest is not known for having a lot of old growth diversity because of our prairie habitats and glaciation, et cetera. So most of your woodlands, most of our forest lands are on the two coasts, but those are stark numbers. That comes from the old growth forest network, which is why I'm shifting to them now. So we've talked about what old growth forests are and kind of what they aren't. This particular organization, the Old Growth Forest Network, reached out to me and to my colleagues. They're a national network. They're a not-for-profit. They work across the United States and I believe increasingly partnering in Canada, but maybe elsewhere. But their focus is the US. They're trying to build, as a national not-for-profit conservation organization, a national network of protected old growth forests. And that part's key. Because many of these old growth forests that remain, that small number that remain, they aren't held by forest preserve districts like Lake County Forest Preserve. Many of them are in private ownership. Many of them are held by public agencies, but not in protected status, the way your Lake County Forest Preserves are. So basically, many of these remnant old growth forests and remaining old growth forests are threatened by development. So this network, the Old Growth Forest Network, seeks to expand, I should have said the actual protection of, I should have started with that. They mean to actually turn existing stands of forested land and protect them from future development. They certainly mean to educate. They mean to advocate for protection and policymaking, and I believe funding as well. Now, for the record, I don't work for them. They're just a really good partner of ours. So we could have gotten them on the call, but they're busy. They're working all over the country. Their goal, you'll see why they're busy, is to have, their stated goal is to have one dedicated forest in every county where forests grow. So I looked it up. There are just over 3,100 counties in the United States. And about, according to OGFN, 2,370 of those counties are where forests grow. Think about it. Parts of Nevada, not going to see a forest probably. But 2,370 counties do have forests, and their goal is to get one in each county. I was like, that's interesting. Why? They're trying to spread a deep, wide, committed national network of people who care about this. Right now, and they're only in about I think a real year and a half into this initiative. I know they started earlier than that, but only very recently have they brought on national organizers, or I should say regional organizers. So currently there are, I think, 168 different dedicated forests in 34 states. And here's a map of that. So the dark green is where they have at least one dedicated site, and then the white are potential, including Alaska and Hawaii. And some of these states have, I was going through their pages, 10 to 12. Many of them, like Illinois, have 1 to 3. Illinois has 3, including Lake County. This organization has a staff of 9, so that tells you how big their job is, working across the United States. And then they rely on a national network of volunteers. And I'm going to tell the story of how St. Francis Woods became dedicated as part of the OGFN, talking about that network of volunteers. So now shifting to the Lake County situation, it was more than a year ago when staff from OGFN reached out to me and asked me if we would entertain a dedication of St. Francis Woods. You may know, again, we're back to the Lake County map. You may know where it is, but for those who don't, St. Francis Woods is right there in the middle at Independence Grove. You may also know that you may guess it's our most visited preserve by far. Much more than 1 million people enter Independence Grove every single year. And on a weekend, beautiful weekend day in the summer, I kid you not, you can hear 400 different languages spoken at Independence Grove. It's really a melting pot of Lake County's residents. So what's interesting to me is that this is just a quick snapshot of the 9 other places in Lake County, 9 other preserves that we hold that have old growth forests. So if you don't know your map, because you don't have the map memorized like I do, down at the bottom you have Ryerson Conservation Area and Cahokia Flatwoods. Both of them most likely would have old growth forests. Even Granger Woods, which I didn't star, MacArthur Woods for sure, going upward. To the west, Lakewood certainly has old growth forests, and Grant Woods up there. Susan, I saw you on here. Your Grant Woods certainly has old growth forest. Ethel's Woods Forest Preserve, and then Dutch Gap, and then of course Van Patten Woods. These are all locations that could have been nominated for dedication into the old growth forest network. And by the way, they still could. There's no rule that you can only have one. But we started with Independence Grove and St. Francis Woods, partly because, well, I'll tell you how it came about. I mentioned that OGFN relies on a network of volunteers. So they have a regional organizer. In our case, his name is Nick Sanchez, great guy. But he didn't find us. Vic and Ann Berardi found us. I don't know if any of you go to Green Drinks in Libertyville, but Vic was just talking about Huck Watch, where he's a big volunteer monitor. Some of you may know Vic or Ann. They are volunteers with OGFN, and they did the research. I think this is kind of interesting. They came to us, Nick and Vic and Ann came to us, to me, when they had done all the research of what to prove that St. Francis Woods should be considered an old growth forest. And Vic had looked at some of those other preserves that I mentioned on the previous slide. But he was referencing surveys that had been done in the past, Flora of the Chicago region, all kinds of literature about our St. Francis Woods. And he stepped forward with this nomination and asked us if we'd be interested. So now just a little bit about that site. So Independence Grove is right there in the middle of the county. It's ideal for encouraging the public to come. That's one reason why Vic and Ann nominated this one, and we agreed with them that it was a great idea. That particular site is about 80 acres. I'm going to foray a little bit into what I know about St. Francis Woods, and it is dominated by red and white oaks. But other native trees in the site would be hickories, basswood, black cherry, and sugar maple, of course. It was first surveyed in 1840. Some of you may know the history, but this particular part of Independence Grove Forest Preserve was once, in the 1920s, a kind of a retreat, a nature retreat for Chicago, or for a Chicago orphanage. It was used that way for a number of decades, and then it became owned by the Chicago Archdiocese, and also was kind of a retreat house and a place for both young women and young men and young people to kind of come out from the city and enjoy nature. And Linda earlier was asking me about the number of buildings. There at one time were a number of buildings on the site. So what we call St. Francis Woods is actually larger than 80 acres, because at one point parts of it were impacted by development, by these kind of camp facilities. Those structures have all been removed before the Forest Preserves took ownership of it. I believe most of them were removed before we took ownership of the site. But those remaining 80 acres were never cleared. They were never timbered, considerably, possibly a bit, but they were never clear cut. And we're talking about this 80-acre parcel is between the Des Plaines River itself and the Des Plaines River Trail. So it was the other side of the eastern side of the preserve where those buildings were. And then they, through those years of ownership, the forests themselves remained intact. So what we know today, and we have to just guess based on, well, my colleagues guess, I don't, but they guess based on size of the trees and their knowledge of trees, that most of them are between 100, most of these trees are between 150 and 200 years old. But there's at least one ancient oak that we believe is 400 years old. We won't know until, God forbid, sometime it falls. I'm now orienting you to St. Francis Woods. You're actually standing at the southern tip of the 80-acre section that's been dedicated, and you're looking south across the lake at Independence Grove. This is yet another reason why this was an excellent site to have this dedication for Lake County compared to all those other beautiful preserves and beautiful old growth forests in those preserves. This 80-acre parcel is steps away from a big parking lot, a big picnic shelter, and 3 miles of gorgeous trails around the lake at Independence Grove. If you need more convincing, here's some shots from the year before, like leading up to the dedication. This is the Des Plaines River Trail. This is actually, some of it's in the fall and some of it's in the spring. As I say, the process started more than a year ago when OGFN reached out and Vic Berardi reached out. So we worked together for about a year. We were putting some paperwork together and making the case. I think you can see we made it. This is from May. Gorgeous. So the process, sorry, I'll step back one. The process was, from the point of view of OGFN, it was a simpler one. They knew, and we proved, that St. Francis Woods is in permanent protection. As you all know, that property cannot be sold for development, would not be clear cut. We do, they're aware that we do take down trees for restoration purposes. When we take trees down, or even maybe sugar maples, it's in service to the greater ecosystem function of the site, and they're comfortable with that. They understand that managing old growth forests sometimes means taking down trees, but not for timber production, and we would never do that. So because we were already under permanent protection, all we had to do in the actual process was simply passing a resolution past our Board of Commissioners that said, we will never timber the site. We will continue to manage it for its highest ecosystem function, which is what we do. So once we had the resolution passed, all that remained was to have a public celebration. So why do we go to all this? Why is Old Growth Forest Network spending precious resources doing all of this? I think it's really important. You all are the choir, right? I know you are. You know how important these sites are. But if you're in a agricultural county where I grew up, for example, and there's a small 12-acre parcel of old growth forest, you may love that forest, but you may not know that it's important in a national or even global context. So I think it's important, reflecting back on this partnership, that it puts beloved local forests across the United States into that bigger context and says, people have an important connection. That's that earlier definition of why old growth forests are important, the social and cultural benefits of them. But I think it's really neat when you can take, people's love of that place where they've brought their children and grandchildren and then connect it to the bigger issues. It also, for OGFN and for the forest preserves, it engages volunteers and maybe even donors. Volunteers are donors, and donors are volunteers. Certainly shows, I think, Vic and Ann, for example, and then those who've stepped forward since, that they can be a part of making the forest preserves a stronger place, which many people want to do, or make forests, national old growth forests stronger and healthier. And of course, what we're trying to do, and what is in my department, is to do this kind of work so that we can educate policymakers, we can prove to funders that it's important that they put their resources here, and we can show visitors and the public just how special their Lake County lands are. So just a couple of shots from our public celebration. This was on May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, when we had 115 people come out on a Friday morning to gather and hear some version of what I'm telling you, and to take a walk down the Des Plaines River Trail. So right now they're on the Des Plaines River Trail, and they're with Ken Click, my colleague, who's a restoration ecologist, and he's sharing some of what makes this site very special. This is another factor of why we chose this site. You can experience it from this accessible trail. It's open to all, that goes, 15 miles north and 15 miles south, actually even longer south. The Des Plaines River Trail is kind of a gem in its own. And to have this old growth forest sitting right next to it's pretty special. So 2 more slides, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm right on time. What's next? So what's next for old growth forests? I know that our friends at OGFN are trying to grow the network. Again, they have just about 170 dedicated forests. So they have more than 2,000 to go, if you do the math. So maybe you've been to Idaho, like Rosemary, for example, and you experienced an old growth forest, you got connections in that community where you went to a really special place, let them know they can do this. Or if you vacation in Michigan, there aren't that many old growth forests dedicated in Michigan or maybe Wisconsin. Maybe you have a second home. Think about where you go and think about places you love that aren't here in Lake County, and maybe you step forward or you inspire other people to help. What's next for OGFN? They're certainly meaning to protect old growth forests that need protection, those that are in private ownership, encouraging them, getting the resources, supporting. I know they're supporting tax incentives for private landowners to put these old growth forests into conservation easements. So the OJFN, and I think by extension, we, because we're part of their network, are giving them the weight so that federal policymakers will listen and know that this is something that's really important to Americans. And I think you can see that in the executive order that I started with and the work that the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management and all those agencies are doing to understand what old growth and mature forests need in the US and then get those resources. And I think the OGFN, and again, by us extension, are helping prioritize the funding of those recommendations so that we all manage old growth forests better. And this is the very last slide. I thought I'd tell you what's next for the Lake County Forest Preserves, because I would be remiss if I just didn't paint that picture for you. Of course, it's our job to protect more forests and the other natural habitats of Lake County, prairies and wetlands, open water, lakes, rivers. Not just to acquire more land, but to do the restoration work that they need to take degraded forests and other degraded natural habitats and restore them to their highest ecological function. That is what we think about day in and day out. I think about it from a funding point of view or from a policymaking point of view, but the vast majority of my colleagues are out there doing the work every day, and volunteers, endless numbers of volunteers. This is what we're going to keep doing. One thing we are working on, and it's just a quick plug, is we have means to get the capital dollars to do this. We know we can, or we believe we can convince the voters to allow us to purchase more land and preserve it. They have been supportive of funds to allow us to restore more land. What we're doing through private fundraising is working to endow those investments by the public through private philanthropy. So one of the things that's next for the Forest Preserves is building up a permanent endowment. And the way the endowment works is endowments are gifts of money that are invested, and then you only spend the proceeds if you're not familiar what endowments are. So it's kind of a novel approach for a public agency, but through our Preservation Foundation, we've raised just under $7 million toward a $20 million goal. And when we hit $20 million in our endowment, our projections say that that will generate $800,000 a year forever. So it's really a means of diversifying the resources of the district, but those resources must be used in a very specific way. They must be used to take St. Francis Woods and ensure that we can always fund the management of it. So it's been restored to a beautiful condition. It's been done with, precious public dollars. And now these private dollars are helping to make sure that we'll always have the money to keep those lands as functioning as at their highest possible condition, if that makes sense. So that is what's next for the Forest Preserves. We're always working to engage more volunteers and donors. And then the last piece of what's next for the Forest Preserves goes back to that power of the referendum. We are intending to, just so you're all aware, we are intending to put a question on the ballot in November of next year. So that's one of the things I'm working on. A capital referendum, and the last time we did this was in 2008. In 2008, it was 185 million, and it passed with 66% of the vote. It's been quite a while, and politics are a little different since then. So at the moment, I don't know the dollar amount for you all, but you should know that we're working between now and basically this time next year to understand how much we need, how much we think we can put on the ground, and then we'll make the case to the voters of Lake County about the impact that will have on the Forest Preserves. Excuse me. So stay tuned on that. When the time comes, I'd love to educate you on what that referendum will do when the time is right. Look at that, 2 minutes to spare.
Perfect. Oh, Rebecca, thank you so very much. And we'll leave that up there for a second so that people can copy down the information. Very interesting presentation. And we're so proud of our Lake County forest preserves here. And I know we have people online that might be in other communities, but come to Lake County sometime and
Yeah.
take a look around. So Linda is going to look in the chat box and see if we have some questions. And I think I'll stop your slide now, if that's all right.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I'll stop share. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And
Hi
then
there.
we'll put this, you have the spotlight.
Well,
Okay.
I want to thank you again and thank Rosemary for, I've just turned everything off. I don't know how.
Uh-oh.
There you go.
Well, now we don't see.
We do have a few questions for you. Number one, is there a picture of that 400-year-old tree somewhere?
Oh, no. Okay.
If
Assignment
we
number
want to
one.
go out there
Go
and
get a
hunt it
picture.
down.
Yeah, Ken Click has, I think he might have the photo. It's well off trail. I've actually not hiked my way out there. I've stood with him on the DPR where he said, it's back there. I can ask him though and send it to you, Linda, if I can get one.
Sure.
Okay.
If it's off trail, I mean, it would just, I would think more than, I'm not the only knucklehead that would like to walk out there and say, yeah, I saw a 400-year-old tree this afternoon.
Well, I'd be happy to ask.
Alrighty, and if I get that information, I will put it in the email I'll send all who have attended and who registered next week. We had
Yep.
one other question, and that was, would the savannas, we're a prairie, we have a lot of prairies. Is there a reason the savannas wouldn't qualify if they haven't been chopped down? I realize most of the savannas were chopped down and named for Oak Grove and Long Grove and Morton's Grove.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I mean, I'd love to see let's see, old growth savanna network. But obviously you're aware they're very different habitat types. Not that one is better than the other, but forests, I think in the United States, we actually, if I'm not mistaken, we actually have more land in forests. I know we've lost a lot of it. Those numbers are quite startling, how we have less than 5% on the West Coast and less than 1% in the East Coast. But if you talked about prairie or even savanna, which is an even smaller habitat type, where far less than 1% has remained in the United States. So I think that's just a recognition that while locally we care very much about our savannas, and the Lake County Forest Preserves and others are working hard to bring the savanna environment back, there's actually just so little of it that I don't know that you could have enough to have old growth savanna. Most of the savannas you see are we have been, not just we, but conservation organizations have been returning them because they were they're a transitional habitat between the vast prairies and the forested lands. So savannas are really pretty rare as they are, rare on their own, and even more rare because of development in the United States. So I think it's a long way of saying that, boy, I wish we could have an old growth savanna network, but I just don't know that there are that many that exist. We will keep restoring savannas in Lake County. As of course, what you all know this, but most of the time we're acquiring, farmland, for example, and after a number of years, excuse me, we're returning them to wetlands and prairie lands, and where possible, we're adding savanna environments, a transition to the forest that might be neighboring. But there's just so little remaining savannas left, at least in the U.S.
Well, we chopped them down and built houses.
Yes, we have.
Rosemary had a question, and it was about, with all the fires that are with global climate change, does the Forest Preserve have any policies or plans for protecting the preserved lands and the forests?
Yeah, well, we use prescribed fire all year round for the intention of the prescribed fire program is to reduce fuel loads. So it is in one element about protecting public safety. Because there is a threat. I don't want to pretend there is not a threat. We actually we are a bit concerned about the remaining fuel loads on our own lands, and more often it will be on some of our smaller preserves where you're talking, I've learned about this, you're talking 20, 40 acres of property where the fuel loads have been allowed to grow because it's difficult to burn a site of that size. And so, it's like neglecting to clean your bathroom or something, it just kind of builds up, and then you end up having a problem. So I would say, we have an active program for prescribed burn management. We are under-resourced in that because every year there is more and more need for that. We recently were able to, believe it or not, overcome some barriers with the crews we have by training a volunteer burn crew. We didn't used to allow volunteers to do prescribed burning on the scale that our staff are allowed to do prescribed burning. And because we have limited staff, only a couple of crews, they tend to focus on acres as opposed to specific habitats or specific preserves. So what's really great about our volunteer prescribed burn program is that we are now equipped and we have trained our volunteers, and they can more often get to the smaller sites, those sites that maybe for expediency's sake in the past or efficiency's sake, our staff crews were focusing on a 100-acre burn. But what we really needed is a small crew to do a 12-acre burn at a real high priority site. So I'm excited to say that started happening last spring for the first time, and it will continue this fall. Now, our burn windows in the spring and fall are very chaotic. Sometimes we'll have 3 weeks, and sometimes it'll feel like we have 3 days. And that is a factor of changing climatic conditions. So we all have our fingers crossed for this fall. But Rosemary's right. I think we're behind on reducing those fuel loads. Fortunately, I don't know that the environment of Lake County would put huge swaths of our county at risk. I don't believe that's the case. We have a lot of water. It's hard to imagine us having the kind of tragedy that they saw in Hawaii. But I don't want to be proven wrong. We're doing everything we can to get ahead of that. Sorry, long answer to a short question.
No, thank you. We're interested in it. And Doug wants to know, how often do you burn? Is it every other year, or is it dependent upon the environment?
Well, it is always dependent on the environment, and we don't know if we can burn a site until the morning of the site, really. So we have to be very nimble, which means it just adds to the complexity of that program. And actually, especially under our current natural resources director, Patty Vett, she instituted a scientific review of our burn data. And so she looked backward in time and was basically saying, how often have these sites been burned? What is the burn frequency? And what is the biodiversity? The species richness, I should say. Comparing those two, she and her whole team are identifying the most optimal burn windows. So a single site could be burned every year. It could be burned every other year. It could be burned every 4 years. And I would say it's just like all science, it's an ongoing question. It's one that's every year she's collecting data. They are collecting data to determine how often sites should be burned. So it's not a satisfying question, because I can't tell you that every forest is burned every 4 years and every prairie is burned every year, because we're still learning. But we are doing it in a scientific way. We are doing the burning, and then we are following up and doing the monitoring so that we can understand, did we put our resources to the best use? Because of course they're scarce. So that's my answer. It really is variable. And then it very much depends on the conditions of the day.
Is there a policy, should a natural fire occur, what procedure would be followed? Do you let it burn, or do you put it out?
Oh, it has happened. I'm aware of one situation within the it was during COVID actually, and it wasn't on our property, but it was very near, where an unexpected fire broke out. And because none of the agencies that do prescribe fire, we always know, we always signal, we tell the fire department, we tell the residents right before we do it. And that's true for other agencies that do prescribed burning. When it's a surprise like that, we're the ones who say, hey, come and put it out, fire department. So generally the procedure is to put out a fire that was not intentionally set for prescribed burn purposes. So even though it might be nice to, oh, well, it's happening, let's get some of that fuel load out of the way, it's just too risky.
Rosemary, would you ask your question? My screen has disappeared.
Rosemary, you're muted.
We see your
Oh.
screen, we see your
Hi.
picture, but we don't see you. My question was, could Rebekah talk and explain a little bit about connecting natural sites to enable easier movement by wildlife?
Well, I can talk about it conceptually. As I say, unfortunately, I'm not a scientist. I had a slide, a very colorful picture of Lake County with, the pink and the orange. That was from our green infrastructure model and strategy. And what that did at a very basic level is we took every data set we could get our hands on, and we applied layers of data, and we said, where can we do restoration? And then just because we can, it doesn't mean we, the forest preserves, should, because we don't own everything, nor should we own everything. So what we have done with all of those data sets, and you just saw one picture of a 200-page report, is we've aligned the highest priority, we call them area conservation opportunity areas. That's our word for it. And each of those conservation opportunity areas in Lake County, and there are 5 of them. These are think of a 10,000 acre swath. For example, the upper and southern Des Plaines River habitats, those are 2 of our priority areas. But each of those core areas of where we believe we should be working are connected by habitat corridors, just like you were saying. Now, those habitat corridors from our model, this is just the way we see Lake County, those are going to not just go anywhere. Think about it, the northern and southern Des Plaines, that's not a great example because it's a river, so it's already pretty well laid out. But in the western part of the county, we have the Lake McHenry wetland complex. And so we have 2 core areas where we're working, and we didn't just kind of like draw a line between the 2. We drew the line looking at current ownership, land ownership, like where is the farmland? We're going to avoid the highly developed residential areas or that industrial complex, so our corridors are going to follow the opportunity as much as the potential, because all of Lake County has potential restoration, right? We could tear down everything and restore the whole site. That's not what we are. We're a suburban county with 700,000 residents who want to live and work here. So we're looking, yes, about where should we be doing our work? Where should we focus our resources? These core areas, and then we're connecting them based on opportunity. Now I know that's a really big, vague answer. If you wanted something more than that, but that's what we live and breathe that green infrastructure model, because we only have so much money, and it tells us where to put those resources. And of course, funders like that. One part of my department, is matching our needs with funding opportunities, and boy, do they love it when you can say, look, this project is in these 5 different plans. That means everybody agrees it's really important. So.
Well, I'm not aware of any other questions, and so we will say thank you once again to everyone who attended, and for our guests. Rebekah, you were wonderful and have, I'm sure, planted many seeds for future visits. We do have more programs coming up this fall. On October 15th, we will welcome Dr. Dana Garrigan, conservation biologist from Carthage College, and I might add an exceptional photographer for our October program. Dana will share the significance of the Ramsar site, which is, I think, part of the lake plain.
Yeah, I was talking about that.
Rebekah was, well, we're going to hear more about it. It's the Ramsar Chaiwaki Prairie, which runs along the lake. It starts in northeastern Illinois and then goes up through up to about Present Prairie. And he will be here to tell us about that and about how people save the prairies. Hopefully we may all be enticed to go out and take a walk along that site. And then on Sunday, November 19th, we will welcome Mila Marshall, who is one of our own Sierra Club professionals, and Mia will explain the significance of forever chemicals. You may have heard them called PFAS, PFA, and these are chemicals that are pervasive and are becoming more and more a part of our daily vocabulary. So we will be learning about those in November. Once again, I urge you all to register on our Woods and Wetlands website. We'll send you the address, and should you miss it, you'll get an email in the week after the program, and you can watch it whenever you have time. We will also be promoting these in the Woods and Wetlands newsletter. So I thank you all once again for joining us. We're delighted to have our fellow enthusiasts attend, and we look forward to seeing you in October. Good night, and thank you all.
Good night. Thank you.